All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Spin That Shit podcast. We got a great guest today. We're going to be talking about some very exciting stuff, I think. And it's all banjo talk on this one. Banjo history down to the roots of it, and Dom Flemons is with us. He's going to demonstrate some things. Basically, he's going to take us to school and give us a little history lesson on everything. We cover quite a bit in this podcast. We've talked about already doing a part 2 later and diving deep in some other artists and maybe different banjo makers. Who knows? We'll make it up from there. But check out Dom on social media. Go catch him on the road. He's doing some shows. Super talented, wealth of knowledge, great guy. I'm super thrilled he sat down with me today. But before we do that, just want to say thanks to everyone for joining and subscribing, sharing, liking, doing all that good stuff to keep this going. We're starting to make a little bit of noise here, so very, very much appreciate that. If you could do me a favor and send this podcast to one of your friends or someone you think that might be interested in music. I think that pretty much covers it. So let's go talk to Dom and talk about banjos. And I'm always amazed by the stack of records behind you.
Well, I try my best, gotta keep everything together. If people have been asking me how do I categorize them, and at some point I'll probably put a video up about it because I got them kind of broken down in all sorts of categories.
Man, that's a full-time job in itself, right?
Well, at first, but then it actually gets easier once you make the first list. Then it's just updating from there. But
yeah. Good deal. All right. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about banjo history.
Yeah, man.
We could really start almost. I mean, there's so much to talk about. It's almost overwhelming. And there's a lot of controversy of dates when stuff, is drawn back to. Mm-hmm. I think we should start as far back as we can possibly go and move forward. If that sounds all right with you.
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay. Yeah. So when was the first depiction of the banjo? When did we first find out there was an instrument pre-recording?
Oh, well, that goes back to the early colonial period into the 1700s. Now, for people that are really interested in getting deep into this particular history, there was a woman by the name of Dana Epstein who published a book called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals. Now, what she did is that she went into the New York Public Library, and at the time, she was asking different scholars about early African American music that preceded the Civil War. And she was told by most of the scholars of the day that there was no documentation of any African American music before the Civil War. And so she actually went out of her way to prove that there was documentation. She went into the deep archives and she compiled the book Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, showcasing different references to early African American music, not just banjo necessarily, but also early mentions of balafon, of doing the ham bone, dancing, the bones, accordion, any number of. But that's probably where I would start, because that's really the bedrock of a lot of early African American secular folk music scholarship.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to go down that rabbit hole. I'm sure you know a lot more than, I've scratched the surface on this stuff over the years. And so
one of the things about that early period, just to kind of give a little bit more context, is that we have just scant pieces of information, moments when people happen to mention what the community was doing in terms of music making. So that's a lot of where our information comes from. We also have several different early drawings and depictions of the banjo. One of the earliest is from a fellow by the name of Hans Sloane, and I believe it was in the mid 1700s. He drew several pictures of the early bansa, as they called it, and it was a Caribbean instrument, I believe, of maybe Haitian origin. And so you have this
Okay.
African and Caribbean diaspora because, of course, African music making tradition with the technical term is semi-spiked lutes, which just means the neck goes all the way through goes through the body halfway through, compared to a spiked lute, which you'll see with some African instruments, the stick goes all the way through the body. That's a spiked lute, and a non-spiked lute or is a semi-spiked lute is a banjo. And so you find many different versions of banjo looking instruments in Africa. You also find them in different parts of the world, but for the story of the United States, we focus back on early African music making traditions and imagining over a long period of time until maybe the 1820s to the 1840s. We begin to see tangible references to banjo as we can think of it now in the modern day. But before then, you had a lot of different musical traditions that were sort of blending together by the nature of the slave trade and plantation culture and the generations that developed after the birth of the United States.
Yeah, it's crazy because the stereotypes around just the banjo itself. This history is so rich and goes way back, way before, what I think people, when they first hear banjo, what's popularized in popular culture, Beverly Hillbillies and all that, Scruggs really bringing it out there. And once they get there and they start digging deeper, it's just like, it's a world instrument to me. I mean, it's amazing. And even today, like I noticed on social media, on Instagram, I follow the hashtag banjo. I don't know if you do, but
Okay. I'll see stuff occasionally, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll just follow that tag and whatever comes up. And more often than not, I say 9 out of the 10 times, it's not even in this country. The posts are like very Caribbean rooted stuff and different styles, a lot of tenor style banjos. It's not that bluegrass is what a lot of people would first go in their mind. But I think I just thought that was crazy. Even today, in today's world, that the majority of those hashtags are all, older styles of play, ragtime and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they have all the, the newer age stuff too. But
well, absolutely. One of the things to think about in the 21st century is that even though we are looking back at many of the early roots of the banjo, there has been an elaborate history that has followed this instrument ever since it was introduced to folk musicians of the United States. Of course, when you get to a certain point, I mentioned the 1830s as sort of a cutoff date, because as you begin to precede those eras, you find that different parts of the United States were Spanish colonies or French colonies, and many times the African music making traditions followed the colonies. If you can understand what I mean with that, where Spain had certain Black people of different African origin that were a part of their culture, as well as the French. And so it begins to break down a little bit more when you get into that pre-1830s era of the United States. So it precedes the birth of the country in a certain way. But by the 1830s, the banjo itself as an instrument begins to gain popularity with circus performers at first. Many of them performing in blackface, many of them solo performers. But the notion around the banjo was that it was always a representation of African American culture, of Black people in some form or another. Of course, there were different performers, again, being a comedy and a variety show that would eventually develop on this style. It would have every sort of stripe of comedy, from the horrible, degrading type to much more lighter fare, the chicken crossed the road, which is another a joke that comes from the early minstrel stage. Of course, it's not something we would associate. It's now just sort of an American joke catchphrase. But the banjo, you have to imagine the banjo becomes one of the main instruments of this early minstrel show. And in a time before mass media, theatrical styles like the minstrel show traveled around the country, and it became the first codified American art form and lowbrow American art form instead of European leaning or leaning toward sophisticated art. This was down home music and down home entertainment. And so the banjo, along with the fiddle and the bones and the tambourine, that became the main template for the music that accompanied this style of performance art. And so, yes, the banjo is a world instrument, but by the 1830s, it really hones into the United States. And another major thing that happened is after the Reconstruction era, going into 1900, when strict segregation was implemented into American society, the banjo took another face as well. It became a instrument and a symbol of ragtime and also Euroclassical style of African American inflected music. And so it took a whole other style. So a lot of times when we think of Scruggs style finger style banjo, many of those performers that influenced Earl Scruggs, people like Charlie Poole, or let's say even for some of the more obscure people, Wilmer Watts, or also Doc Walsh, who played in the Carolina Tar Heels. They play in this very intricate finger picking style that is akin to this early ragtime music. And of course, there were cylinder recordings being made by people like Wes Osman, who was a ragtime classical banjo virtuoso. So the banjo took on this sort of theatrical history that went far past the more homegrown music of African American culture, which is where it had started for at least 100 years. So now you have a divergence away from the African root, and then all of a sudden it becomes like a sort of a high class popular parlor instrument, because then it also was it became very popular with ladies in the parlor playing the banjo and playing light melodies in the parlor to entertain guests. And so the guitar also sees a rise in popularity. And this sort of is a moment when African American music stylistically starts to move toward the blues, and the guitar starts to become popular. So many African.
Sorry to interrupt. What date would you say that would be roughly?
Well, we don't know for sure when the first guitar players, African American guitar players, emerged in this history, but it's around the 1898, 1899, 1900, when ragtime really came into style. And also this same type of parlor music. There was also a great movement for parlor guitar styles. And so guitar and banjo sort of began to take on sort of a parallel history, which they always had in some regard. Many of the early references to banjo describe the instrument like a four-stringed guitar or some variation on a guitar-like instrument. And so after you have the early 1900s, banjo remained in certain pockets of the African American community, particularly in the South. And then also it also became popular as in jazz music, and a lot of early jazz features the tenor banjo. And the style of African American music that is a part of that tradition is more of a harmonic and melodic style that's more akin to jazz. Yet it's also connected to the early country fiddle tunes and the country breakdowns. And there are times when you find the tenor banjo and jazz bands playing older songs like I'm Alabama Bound or Salty Dog or any of those types of numbers. And you'll find that there's a tradition of old time country music as well within those repertoires. So that's kind of a broad history of the banjo, sort of in its natural element, leading up into, I guess, let's say the Second World War. And after the Second World War, an interest grows for non-commercial folk music, and the banjo takes on a whole other life of its own. That's where bluegrass begins to develop in the post-World War II era, taking the old time numbers and turning them more into string band jazz in its own type of way. And I think in some ways, when bluegrass became popular, it really changed the whole nature of the banjo. So then it became very much a southern rural style of popular music, and that's where you really see a trajectory of the banjo becoming very much a white instrument associated with cowboy hats. Hat acts. Because of course acts like Flat and Scruggs made it onto television, and so that's a lot of people's first impression of the banjo. I mean, that was how it was for me. Between that and the old Fleischman cartoons where they had jazz bands, and that was kind of my introduction to the banjo, seeing it, and I think that's most people's introduction as well.
Right. Well, can you recall the first time you heard the banjo and you were just like taken by it?
Oh yeah. One of the very first times I think I heard the banjo and it moved me, there were two moments. So the first time I think I heard a banjo and it made me think that I should learn it was actually watching a movie by the name of Harold and Maude, a little independent film. And they actually have a song called "If You Want to Sing Out, Sing Out," from Cat Stevens. And the main character at the end of the movie plays a banjo and he starts to pick this song. And so I remember hearing that and finding that sound to be appealing, not knowing really what a banjo was or anything like that. But it really wasn't until I heard "Rollin' My Sweet Baby's Arms" by Flat and Scruggs. That was when I really heard the banjo having a dynamic sound and just thinking that that was really cool. The next moment, I picked up an album called Sweet Emma and her Preservation Hall Jazz Band, and that was my first real introduction to New Orleans jazz. And so that's what got me thinking about jazz banjo. And then, of course, Black Banjo Songsters of North Carolina and Virginia was another album I heard later on that got me thinking about African American banjo playing. But that kind of led me from my first experiences with the banjo in Phoenix, which also included a lot of local players. There were a couple of different banjo players. One guy played old pop tunes on a tenor banjo. Another fellow was a cowboy singer. He played 5-string banjo. Another fellow played stuff like the Anthology of American Folk Music. And so there were bluegrass players as well as old-timey players as well, Irish tenor banjo. And that was all in the local folk community. And I heard all these sounds before I had learned myself. But once I got my hands on a banjo, I then got into the music of Gus Cannon because I was into the blues, and that got me into another type of banjo playing. Doc Boggs, Clarence Ashley. I sort of went down the rabbit hole there. My personal story sort of veers in a bunch of different directions just because I had access to records in the junk shops.
That's awesome. Yeah, my first time, I think, I'm sure I've heard it, but the one that sticks out in my mind was going and hearing Ralph Stanley. He was the main reason I wanted to play a banjo. I'm sure I heard it before then. I just couldn't remember where. But that Clinch Mountain backstep,
yeah,
that number I thought was just something else. Then from there, I've always been addicted. But
yeah. And it's interesting with bluegrass. It's such an accessible style of music, and I always think that's because those guys played on the radio so much. They knew how to record it and play it in such a way that it just explodes out of your speakers. And I mean, if you get the bug for if you don't get the bug for banjo from at least something, I feel like something might be wrong with you. But if you hear a bluegrass band really knocking it out, there's something to that. And and for me, I was always searching for a new sound. I was actually reminded of a record I got here in the collection of a fellow by the name of George Pegram, and a beautiful album called Pickin' and Blowin', which is George Pegram on the banjo and a fellow by the name of Red Parham on the harmonica. And it's just a really great album of sort of a folk version of a 3-finger style and harmonica, playing some of the old time numbers. And I just always kept an eye out for that sort of stuff,
Yeah. I've kind of now, ever since I've been probably messing around with the banjo for a little over 10 years now. But I've never really taken it serious, but my eye is out for it all the time now. Anything that pops up or online, or if I'm out somewhere, a record shop, I'm drawn to it. It's funny you're speaking about bluegrass, and I just recently read Ralph Stanley's book, Man of Constant Sorrow.
Nice.
In that book, he seems adamant that he is not bluegrass. He said his sound is called the Stanley sound. You're not going to hear dobro with any of his stuff. There might be like one recording he said he'd never liked the instrument, and not very much, hardly any mandolin going on. So he felt like he was its own thing. I just always thought that was funny, because a lot of people, I mean, including myself, would call it bluegrass, just a subgenre, I guess, now.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, those guys all had their own definitions for what the songs are and what they meant. And that's one of the things with the banjo, as we're talking about the history, is that the banjo itself, I always tell people it's a question mark of an instrument, because then you get a player behind it. And that's when you really see different statements of every shade and stripe begin to be presented as this very interesting instrument. The banjo begins to create a sound around itself and around a band, because once a banjo starts going, it's for better or worse, it's a loud instrument, it's a syncopated instrument, and it can really add a lot of drive to the music, whatever you're playing, and that's something I always liked about it. I started out as a drummer myself, before I started to play stringed instruments. And so the banjo, I liked the guitar and felt that I could get some percussive sounds, but the banjo was really the one that really let me kind of let loose on a lot of those rhythmic patterns.
Yeah. Speaking of, all the different styles out there, and it really depends on who has it in their hands, really. You've got several different banjos, and you don't have your own like one niche style. You cover a broad spectrum of different styles of music. Maybe we can back up and kind of go through the types of banjos that are available, and maybe give examples of certain songs, some that you have played, and how they fit, because we know there's 4-string banjos, 5-string, and even 6-string now. So I guess at the beginning it'd be a gourd of some sort, and you yourself have played that on albums, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I have a gourd banjo that I've worked playing for a little bit. Well, do you want me to play a little bit, or would?
No, sure. I didn't know if you had one on hand. Absolutely. I mean, it's not the best audio in the world with the internet, but yeah.
I got this gourd banjo here, and this one's meant to be sort of reminiscent of some of the early banjos that African Americans played early on. And then this one here symbolically sort of captures a lot of what I try to do in my music. These are birds called Sankofa birds. And the idea of the Sankofa bird is that you go back and fetch it. That's one of the rough translations, is you go back to the past, bring the things you need into the present that can lead you into the future. And the banjo sort of does that. Like you can pick at it a whole bunch of different ways. Well, this one's also nice for getting some strong syncopation. Like here's a little one that I came up with called the Coach Driver's Tune.
I love it. That's awesome, man. It's got such a warm tone. Now, what kind of What's the setup on that? What kind of strings are we using here? They're nylon, I'm assuming.
Yeah, these are nylon gut strings here, and
Okay.
this is a calf skin head. It's a calabash body and gourd, and then this is a black palm for the fingerboard. And this was a banjo made for me by a fellow named Bob Thornburg, who I got to meet through Mike Seeger. And so Mike played a really
Oh,
distinctive gourd banjo, and this is the same maker that made this one. And so
okay.
at one point, Bob had reached out to me and told me he wanted to make me a banjo, and he had some time. And so my wife and I, we went through a couple of different early books. The America's African Instrument by Laurent Dubois, as well as that Half Barbaric Twang, and also Jim Bowman's book on the banjo. And we decided to make this beautiful little headstock here out of sort of the best of the headstocks that we could come up with. And so he made that, and then as I mentioned before, he had the Sankofa birds that he was burning on the back here. And so we decided to do a
Okay.
family tree. And the beauty of the gourd banjo is that you get to really you get to hear a little bit of those early roots of the banjo, and especially for folks that are fans of the banjo in general. When you think of the banjo as a high-pitched instrument, to be able to make that high-pitched instrument into a mid-range to low mid-range instrument, in some ways it is similar to I don't know, like slap bass, like Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. It goes into that tone. And if you think of the playing the same type of numbers that you might normally play, like for example, like Old Joe Clark, you can get all sorts of interesting slides and embellishments. And of course, there are no frets on the gourd banjo, so it
Right.
also allows for some really interesting approaches to going from one note to the other, which of course, and once you get into playing banjo, that's what it's all about sometimes, and making your distinct style. So that one's always a fun one to play. I have my 4-string banjo. Now, when I first started to play, I was given a 5-string without a 5th string. I had a
Okay.
friend of mine that was traveling through Europe, and he passed me a banjo. And so I had started playing the guitar by that point. So I learned all the songs I knew on guitar on the banjo with 4 strings. And then, as I mentioned before, I got into jazz banjo. So I'll just kind of do an example. This is a little bit of Keep On Trucking in a sort of jazz style. And so that's a little bit of sort of the jazz style. So you're doing your chord progression, and you're adding a syncopation that is most of the time it's 4 on the floor, but you can add a little bit of extra swing to it. Another type of style I've played for a while, back when I used to play in the Carolina Chocolate Drops, a group I formed back in 2005. One of the players, Layla McCalla, she did a lot of Haitian music, and she did a song called Rose Marie. And so I used to do a solo like this, just to kind of show you a little bit of that, the syncopation in that sort of Haitian style. And so that's a little bit of kind of that Haitian style. And a lot of times when you hear a lot of those bands, they're really strumming away on. And so they're adding a sort of a syncopation that's something along the line of what we would usually hear a tambourine or something playing. But again, if you make that a melodic part of the music, it can really do some very beautiful things. Of course,
Yeah.
I do a lot of old timey music as well as blues. So maybe just a little bit of blues. You can do.
I love that. That's I I'm more of a claw hammer guy now these days. But that's my next step right there. Some added blues. We we brought up Gus Cannon. Big,
Yeah.
I love him. He now I don't know how much, I haven't dug that deep, but what is it right that he played slide on the banjo?
He did.
What was he using, a knife or what was he using? Do you know?
Funny thing about that. So I'll show you a little bit of something with the slide because I was interested in this idea. I'm actually grabbing in a bag here, getting my slide out here. There we go. Uh, so I had heard that Gus Cannon had played slide on one of his recordings, "Po' Boy, Long Ways from Home," and so I was interested in that idea. And I had had a slide anyway from playing the guitar, and so I developed one way of playing it, and then I'll show you the way that Gus Cannon was playing it. So I just decided to do it bottleneck style. I used to do a bunch called Viper Man that was a little jazz number that Sidney Bechet recorded years back, and it went like this. That was the solo section I used to do for that one there. So that was how I thought he might have been playing it, but I found a picture of Gus Cannon that was photographed in the 1960s, and he's actually playing it over his lap like a Hawaiian style guitar.
Okay.
So he did something like. A poor boy, long ways from home. Long ways from home. Been a poor boy, long ways from home.
Yeah, I love that. I like just the total bluesiness of it mixed in on a banjo. A lot of people don't go there when they first think about banjo.
Well, the banjo and the guitar sort of fell off into these sort of convergent paths in the early 20th century. And every once in a while they link back together. But they sort of broke into these different traditions, except for the players that continued to play both. One of my favorite banjo players to analyze is Sam McGee from the early Grand Ole Opry, because he played the 5-string as well as the 6-string. And like a lot of those early Uncle Dave Macon recordings, he's playing a 6-string along Uncle Dave's 5-string. And it's really interesting to hear the way he experimented with the different sounds of the banjo. And he was a great clawhammer player as well. There's a beautiful video of him just displaying a bit of Uncle Dave's banjo playing, really beautiful little bit that I saw years ago. And he was a great clawhammer player as well. But I had even come up with a version of thinking about playing a slide banjo. When I read about Gus Cannon learning about slide banjo, he learned from a fellow named Alec Lee, who was a guitar player he had known. And so he had developed that style from watching a guitar player. I, of course, am a big fan of the blues, and I always loved the sound of Bukka White and his song Poor Boy, which is another song in the same style over the lap. And so I couldn't get that song to work on the banjo, because this is one of the things as well. When playing the blues, the banjo has no sustain. So sometimes the blues can be very tricky to play, because the blues is really built on playing a lick and letting that note ring out a lot of the time. And so the banjo isn't necessarily a blues instrument, but a lot of people have incorporated into their sound. But I happened to fall in love with the sounds of Darby and Tarleton, who was an old group, guitar and Hawaiian guitar. And I thought to myself, I thought to play the song Tom Dooley, and not just any version of Tom Dooley, the Grayson and Witter version that Doc Watson also recorded. And I did a slide version early on of that one, and it sounds a little something like this. So with a little bit of that Darby and Tarleton flavor. Hang your head, Tom Dooley, hang your head and cry. Till for Laurie Foster, and you know you bound to die. Hillside where you beg to be excused. Took her on the hillside and hit her clothes and shoes. Hang your head, Tom Dooley, hang your head and cry. Till for Laurie Foster, and you know you bound to die, bound to die.
That's a great song. Sad song, but great song.
Yeah, and a beautiful version with different lyrics than I had heard previously from a lot of other versions. But yeah, those are a couple of the little experimentations I've made into the. Oh, and then one other way I ended up using the 4-string, actually, in the old group, we had done a song called "Hit 'Em Up Style," and I decided, and I found the song was built on just 2 chords, G minor and D minor. And so I was trying to find a way to be able to create sort of a sound like a rock band, but also make it sound old timey at the same time. And I thought about my old friend Taj Mahal and his song Leavin' Trunk, where he has a really cool guitar line that's like, he has that cool lick. So I came up with something to try to get that vibe on Hit 'Em Up Style, which went like this. So that was sort of another interesting experimentation into trying to create an interesting old-timey modern style of some sort.
Yeah, a good point. I remember seeing you play that live years ago at the Vogue in Indianapolis.
Oh yeah, that was a good time over there.
Yeah, I think I've seen you three different times. Yeah, three times. One there, and then one at the High Five, and then you opened for Old Crow too at the Maroc downtown.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
every show was different. And every show was great, so I love it. This is what I definitely want to hear more about. This thing is a beast.
Yeah, this one here, this six-string banjo here, Big Head Joe, is a unique banjo. This is one that was made by a luthier, an African American luthier by the name of Robert H. McGinnis. And as at first, so just to kind of give you some context on this one here, I found this instrument at the Retrofret Guitar Shop in Brooklyn, and I used to live in New York City. I was there at a Christmas party actually, and Retrofit has all these beautiful vintage guitars and banjos, and they have harp guitars, and it's just a feast for the eyes. And I saw this banjo in the back of the room, just like way in the back. I saw the size of it. I saw it, and I said, "Wait a second, that's a six-string banjo." And from the very beginning, the very first time I had even heard that there was such a thing as a guitar banjo, I think I might have heard Johnny St. Cyr or Papa Charlie Jackson. I think that was the first time I had heard there was such a thing. And I owned a couple of homemade six-string banjos that I'd found at different places along the way. So I was always trying to find it. And I started picking on this banjo, and I just fell in love with it that night. And I saved up for many years to be able to buy this exquisite vintage instrument. So that's how it starts. But I was always drawn to it because it looked and sounds like the banjo played by Papa Charlie Jackson. Now I've done a record called Papa Charlie Done Sung That Song. I did it years ago, and Papa Charlie Jackson was the first solo self-accompanied male blues singer to make popular records. And so before that, the big trend for blues was with the blues divas like Ma Rainey, or blues singers that featured jazz band backing, and that was men and women. But Papa Charlie Jackson really set a new trend for solo blues singers. And he featured the six-string banjo, which is a unique instrument that found popularity, I guess, between the late 1890s. Again, we're talking about this 1880, 1898, 1899, 1900 era, when ragtime becomes very popular. And the banjo becomes an international phenomenon. And so the usage of banjo then turns into a larger novelty in a certain way, because they then begin to make banjo versions of other types of instruments in the string orchestra that included guitars and mandolins. They made little piccolo banjos for banjo orchestras. And a banjo orchestra, in case you've never heard of one, is a orchestra fully made of banjos. And again, I know what you're thinking. You're like, more than banjos on stage. My God, what are you doing? But this banjo in particular was made by a fellow who I mentioned before, Robert McGinnis, and he branded these instruments the Clef Club Deluxe Instruments, and he exclusively branded them for the Clef Club Orchestra, which was started by James Reese Europe, who was a World War I veteran and was one of the people who introduced jazz and ragtime to France and to the world through his 369th Hellfighters band, which is a very elaborate piece of jazz history. But he did all of this work, and particularly in 1912, he did a Carnegie Hall concert featuring a huge banjo orchestra, the 120 banjos, and broke the color bill at Carnegie Hall. And so this is one of the instruments that comes from that era. So again, I was drawn to it because of Papa Charlie Jackson, but it made my knowledge of what Papa Charlie Jackson's music represents even deeper, knowing that this instrument is part of a whole other aspect of early African American music making, particularly jazz and ragtime. But to just play a little bit again, what I love about this, I've shown you the gourd banjo, and this instrument here has an aspect of the same thing I was talking about, the gourd banjo. If you're used to the banjo being a high-pitched instrument, this takes it into this sort of meaty low tone. So just to show you sort of a basic lick on here, I'm going to do just a basic Jimmy Rogers lick, which also makes me think a little bit more about Jimmy Rogers' style. And so it has this beautiful low tone. But Papa Charlie Jackson, one of the things that made his style so interesting is he had a really funky jazz sensibility to his music. So one song I've played for years is Your Baby Ain't Sweet Like Mine. I'll give you a quick chorus just to hear it. Everybody talking about the sweetie nowadays. I got the one with the sweetest ways. Your baby may roll a jelly fine. Nobody's baby can roll it like mine. Your baby ain't sweet like mine. She bake a jelly roll all the time. And when I'm feeling lonesome and blue, my baby knows just what to do. Yes, sir. She even called me honey. She even let me spend the money. Never has a baby put me outdoor. She even buys me all my clothes. I don't want to brag, just want to put you in line. Your baby ain't sweet like mine, oh no. Your baby ain't sweet like mine. Come on, Joe. So that's a little bit of kind of Papa Charlie style, and a lot of his songs are built on this idea of playing the bass notes, or also taking sort of the finger picking idea. There's a lot of Piedmont scales that you can play on it as well and get a lot of these beautiful sounds like.
Yeah, that gives it a whole different sound when you play it like that.
And then it even changes its tone when you play in a larger ensemble as well, which was something I got to do actually about a year or so ago. I got to play on a recording by a wonderful artist, Tyler Childers, and his album Long Violent History. And I was able to experiment with a couple of ideas on Big Head Joe, like the first track actually starts up with Big Head Joe, and we wanted to kind of get a nice little riff in there for the version of Sending the Clowns that he ended up doing. And so I ended up doing a lick like this. And then there was even a part where I did. And so the bass notes on Big Head Joe took on a whole other life when I was playing with the full ensemble as well. So that also really showcases an aspect of this instrument which is really unique to it.
Yeah. That's a great, well, it's not fully instrumental, but that whole piece is beautiful. That Long Violent History.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to see how much, positive review it got and how much light it actually saw, because that stuff isn't really the most popular thing this day and age, but it I think it got quite a bit of attention. So
It truly did. And that was one of the beauties of doing the session is that, again, when we talk about all this history with a lot of this old time music, there's a lot of really harsh history, a lot of harsh facts. There's
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of beautiful music that's come from it. But one of the things that's so beautiful is it has actually stood the test of time. And that's one of the things that was beautiful with that session, that even in 2020, we could all get together, play a lot of these old timey numbers, and pull out new dimensions that we hadn't heard before, and that was literally because we decided to sit down and play it. Like one other song that was fun to play was the Jenny Lynn Rag, where I had a bit that was. And to be able to play some of those old time licks on such a interesting sounding banjo was really a treat as well. Just to be able to experiment with some of those things.
Yeah, that's great. Man, you've listed so much stuff and some names that I haven't heard, and so I'm gonna have a good time going down the rabbit hole later. Um, Trying to think, we'll definitely have to get back and do another part two sometime of some other, maybe pick a couple different artists and talk about them and whatnot. Are you working on any new projects yourself?
Well, I recently finished recording a brand new album that will hopefully be coming out in 2023. That's about all I can say about it right now. It's going to have a nice variety of different instruments and songs. A lot of it I've written, so a lot of old timey songs that are original, but they touch upon some of those themes and those sort of structures of the old timey numbers. So I got that going on. Been doing a lot of essay writing. At the Tyler Childers, I wrote an introductory essay for that album, and I've been writing in a lot of historical essays for different projects that are coming out. I had two singles actually from two artists that reach out to me. One from a woman by the name of Paula Boggs. She had me on a single of hers called King Brewster on her newest album, and she delved into her early family history and found out about an ancestor that was born in 1829. And so this song is a duet between she and I. And then I also got to do another sort of funky banjo thing. I got to play with a wonderful artist by the name of Fantastic Negrito, who I had met a couple of years previously at an event where actually we both got to meet Quincy Jones at the same time. But that's a whole other story there. But
It's a whole other podcast.
He reached out to me out of the blue, and I ended up putting this little funky rhythm to his track. It actually was sort of just one little lick, but they built the groove around it, and it was just doing this. And so they built a rock track around that groove with Big Head Joe in there. So it's a different setting for this 100-year-old banjo to be with some electric instruments knocking it out. So that was sort of an interesting new experiment, but that just came out just recently as well.
Yeah. So to back up a little bit, we talked about the gourd banjo. Then when they started making them, I guess here, I'm not sure where. They didn't have a resonator. Everything was open back, correct?
Well, what's interesting about the history of the making of the banjo is that, I guess, like, again, the 1830s and 40s, you have sort of any player that happens to have learned from somebody. So usually they had either a homemade instrument, or you have people like Joel Walker Sweeney from the Appomattox region. And when you look into the history, I went down to Appomattox for a celebration celebrating African American banjo players. And when asking a little bit about the Sweeney family, they were wheelwrights. So they made wheels for carts. So
Okay.
that gave me a lot of information about making the banjo, because the banjo is shaped like a wheel. So it was interesting that the trade that Joel Walker Sweeney and his family were associated with was something where you had to make wheels. So there's a story there that I feel when it comes to making the banjo into a manufactured instrument. Around the 1850s, I believe, there was a fellow by the name of William Boucher Jr., and he was a German military drum maker. And so he was extremely famous for making his military snare drums during the Civil War. But he then began to make banjos around the same period of time that he gained popularity. And so his style of snare drum based banjos are their own style of instrument, and they're the most common that you tend to see in old tin types, with the headstock kind of like the gourd I was showing, with the twirly curly Q on the top. Those, a lot of those are Boucher banjos. And then there were a few other makers as well that began to start manufacturing the banjos, but it really sort of fit in line with the Industrial Revolution. So you sort of have it in steps. So at first, many of them were open back. And then over time, you begin to have, like with bluegrass, for example, in an ensemble, an open back banjo does not stand out as loud as the other instruments.
Right.
And in some ways, it's similar to what happened with jazz when you have the tenor banjo that usually has a resonator on the back. They usually have super loud banjos as well. It's sort of out of function. You have to get your resonator on the back so that the banjo can overpower the other members of the band. Even though that sounds like a weird thing to say for a banjo, but back in those days, you had to
Yeah.
turn the banjo up as much as you could. So it's sort of a development that grew, especially after the ragtime era, because you start to find that they begin to manufacture playing to the musical styles that were popular at the time. And so by the time you have bluegrass, you have this very wide range of banjos that are available. But then the Gibson resonator really then took off from that point on. And of course, being on the Grand Ole Opry and stuff like that, the
Yeah.
banjo that took the Gibson up there, including Earl Scruggs, and from then on,
Yeah.
sort of
Master tone.
it sort of dictated the way that the banjo went from that there on. The other half of it is around the same time you have someone like Pete Seeger becoming extremely popular, and not only popularizing clawhammer banjo and the open back, but also the long neck banjo, which becomes its own phenomenon as well, which is, in case people aren't familiar with the long neck banjo, Pete needed to expand the number of keys that he could sing. And so he was doing a play where he had to play a song in a certain key. And basically, he went to a luthier who added 2 extra frets onto his banjo so could go down even farther, so to the key of F. And then over time he added another fret, and so he could go down to the key of E while still being tuned to open G fingering. He was playing an open E tuning with no capo, which is why if you look at videos of Pete Seeger, you'll see he's capoed up about 3 most of the time when he's playing. But that's because he can go to E and then capo it up to G, tune his fifth string up to G, and just was able to work a bajillion different ways from there. But his style of banjo also became very popular because he really showcased a style of banjo that was good for accompanying singing. And both he and Earl Scruggs both had their own method books, and they were 2 of the first modern banjo players to have their own method books. Pete wrote his own book, and Bill Keith wrote the definitive Earl Scruggs How to Play the 5-String Bluegrass Banjo book. And from there, that sort of proliferated the sound. So that's also a thing with the banjo too. It's the old-timey sound is something that I think in the 70s on, we have more scholarship than they had, in previous times. And I think that that's something that really dictates the way that people are playing the banjo as well. Because of course, early 2000s, clawhammer really took on a full resurgence. And now you see clawhammer most of the time when you see a lot of banjos.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all fascinating. I love it.
Oh yeah, the myriad of banjo. That's the beautiful thing, and even to this day, there are more people experimenting and creating new sounds on the banjo, and that's always very exciting. Ultimately, you know.
Yeah. How many banjos do you own?
Me, I think I've got. Let me see if I got these three. I got three more. I have another six-string banjo, a standard Gibson six-string banjo that Mike Seeger had once owned, and I keep that in my archives. It's a beautiful standard size compared to Big Head Joe, which is actually a super size. And I have a regular five-string banjo that I'll play, and then I have another tenor banjo, a Vega tenor banjo that I played years on the road. And that also is one that I keep in storage.
Yeah. Man, I think next time when we have you on, we'll have to talk about the different brands and all that. There's so many. Oh,
That,
a lot of homemade stuff and mom and pop shops and big name like Gibson.
yeah. It's been interesting to find an instrument like Big Head Joe where it's such a unique brand. It's been interesting just to be able to research and find out more about this unique instrument, and where its brand leads. It's really something.
Yeah. All right, Dom. I won't take any more of your time. It's been great. This is a learning lesson here. I feel like I'm in school again, back in college or something.
Right.
Unlike this would have been a class I would have liked to be sitting in though.
Yeah, man. Well, it's wonderful. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah. Well, good luck on the road, and if you come through, I'll definitely be at the show.
Awesome. Well, that
So,
sounds like a plan to me.
all right, buddy. We'll catch you on the next one.
All right, that sounds good. Take care, Justin. We'll catch you next time. See you down the road.
See ya.